Welcome to our first Survivor panel on Untold Killing, the new podcast from Remembering Srebrenica and Message Heard that tells the story of Srebrenica through the voices of those who lived through it. This year is the 25th anniversary of the genocide in Srebrenica, and as part of our work in commemorating the genocide, we wanted people from all over the UK to be able to listen to the testimonies of survivors. 2020 has been a year of difficulty for many people, and it greatly reduced the chance for people to hear survivor testimony through in-person community events. As such, at Remembering Srebrenica, we wanted to create the opportunity for people to learn about what happened in an intimate experience directly from the survivors themselves. Thus, we created Untold Killing, an in-depth and powerful way for UK audiences to better understand the consequences of hatred and intolerance in our society. We will be talking more about how to get involved in events with Remembering Srebrenica at the end of the webinar, but for now, I would like to introduce you to our guests. First, we have Jake Otojovich, who is the producer of Untold Killing from Message Heard. He's worked tirelessly over the last few months to bring this podcast to fruition. May I introduce as well Elmina Kulasic, who works on behalf of Remembering Srebrenica with our survivor community, and who is a survivor herself from the Kozarac region of Bosnia. Finally, I'd like to introduce Aida Sarkic-Horton, who is a survivor from the Bihać region of Bosnia and who worked with the UN as a translator during the war. She now works for the YMCA North Staffordshire and has been doing community work and outreach on behalf of Remembering Srebrenica's West Midlands board in Stoke-on-Trent. I want to thank everyone for joining tonight, and I would like to make people aware that there will be polls that will pop up on both Facebook and on Zoom. So please make sure to look out for those and to take part as they appear. I suppose what will start us off, and Jake, I think we'll start with you. So I think we probably should start at the beginning of the project and talk a little bit about the project itself and the process of it. So Jake, what is it about the story of Srebrenica and the genocide in Bosnia that drew you into telling this story? Oh, Jake is muted. There we go.
Hi. So first of all, I would just like to thank you for having me and for being able to speak about the podcast. It's been genuinely a huge honor working on this project for the past few months with Remembering Srebrenica and with the survivors and everyone. And at the very beginning, when we first started talking about making the podcast, I think it was straight away obvious that it was a special story. And for us as a podcast company, we think about the things that we want to produce and the merits of the things that we want to talk about and the messages that we want to get out. And it felt like story of Srebrenica was, it's difficult to imagine a more important story to tell. And when you talk about the story itself from the point of view of a story, it had so many incredible human stories, individual human stories that intertwined together, thousands, tens of thousands of stories. It had the story of the town as a whole. It had the story of the Bosnian War. It had the story of what ended up being genocide. It had the story of politics and the story of humanity, and it's difficult to find a story that encapsulates all of these things better than the story of Srebrenica. And so I think in those very general terms, that was something that made it very special from the beginning.
Has the project changed your outlook on certain things? Particularly, I'm thinking of, obviously, in the UK, we have a rise in identity-based violence, for example, currently, and Hate Crime Awareness Week was obviously this month. Has the project kind of changed the way that you view things, or made the way that you perhaps would tackle certain things different?
Yeah, I think, thinking about this, it's the thing that when we're making the podcast and for me learning the story and researching it and understanding it, there's so many points where I just can't believe that this was allowed to happen, and in many ways that's what it is. It was allowed to happen at so many different points. And I think the main difference in how I look at the world now, I guess, is that you start looking around and seeing things slightly differently and start thinking, oh, is there things that we are allowing to happen right now that perhaps in the future could go a similar way? And it's just that constant awareness of the things people say, the things people do, and it starts with just saying things, and it leads to people doing things, and I think it's just being constantly aware of what am I allowing to happen and what am I doing to help.
Yeah, definitely. It was your first time working with genocide survivors, I believe. Can you tell us what it was like and what your experience was with listening to the testimonies live and interviewing people?
Yeah, so I think the very interesting way that you produce something of this scale is that there is a lot of research that goes into it. So we spent months researching the story of Srebrenica, and then the stories of the individual survivors that we spoke with, that we interviewed. And so going into every single interview, I knew exactly what the story was. And you get to a point where you know a story so well that you feel that nothing can surprise you anymore. But then when you actually speak to them and and hear it live or over the phone, as we did with all of these interviews, there's just something that just surprises you when you hear it from the person's own mouth with their own voice. And even though I knew what was coming next at every point, you start realizing the human aspect of everything that happened. And I think that's the core of it, is the human aspect of all of these things. And so, yes, it was incredibly difficult. And I was saying, fascinatingly, even the interviews that we conducted in Bosnian with three of the mothers, obviously during the interview, our host Alex, she speaks Bosnian, our consultant producer Nadan also does, and I was the one on the call who didn't really understand a word of what was said, but just hearing the voices of the mothers, that was just incredibly powerful, especially when we spoke to Kadifa's stories and to Kadifa and hearing her story, and hearing the pain without understanding the words, just hearing the tone of people's voices. It's quite something, which is also the reason why we wanted to keep the voices, even if they're in Bosnian, in the podcast, because I think it just gives it a whole different dimension.
Yes, yeah, it's when you can hear the voices breaking in the background, it definitely lets you know about, it's almost, I've heard some of the listeners of the podcast describe it as though people are very much in the room with them. There isn't a disconnect that they perhaps have felt with other online events where they've listened to videos or things before. It very much feels like you're being told this story directly by someone sat next to you. So it's been the feedback of we've been hearing has been that, this has been an incredible way to listen to the testimony of survivors. Almina, I think the first thing we have to acknowledge is that you are a survivor yourself, and the archiving the stories of survivors is something that you've been involved with for many, many years. But the idea of telling the story of Srebrenica through a podcast was quite a new concept. So what are your thoughts on podcasts around this kind of topic, and what have survivors been saying to you about, what they've heard about the podcast and things?
Well, thank you for having me, Kate. And as Jake said, I'm also honored that I was part of this podcast and that I was really given a chance to work on something that I have not worked before. It is a very different approach. It's the one that is a lot more challenging, because I think we're used to seeing survivors on the screen and we're used to sort of seeing the pain in their eyes. But with this podcast, it's really their voice. And even though I know their stories, in and out, and I've been in a number of meetings and in a number of interviews with them when they were telling their stories to others, but also just having coffee with the mothers and having them recount their stories. With this podcast, it really became very intimate and emotional. And the feedback that I have been receiving is that it's not only educational for all of us, but it's more than educational. It's like having the mothers, as you said, next to them. And that's the hardest thing to do. In the previous project, the hardest thing to do is to get the audience to listen actively, to really listen to the stories and to understand them. And when you have the survivors on the screen or even in the room, there's a lot of distraction that goes around it. But with this podcast, as a listener, you can't really do anything but listen to them. And with the voiceover, where we get a chance to hear the voices, it really brought a powerful impact on how we can learn about a genocide that is still for many ongoing because we have an ongoing genocide denial. But I will start with one of the mothers. When I approached her and when I told her about the podcast and the idea and that we would like to interview her first comment was like, oh, this is a radio documentary. That's how she connected it. She's like, so people that usually don't have time to sit in front of the TV, they will get a chance while maybe driving to work, listen to our story. And when I told her that with this project, she will have to remember maybe more, feel more, and be a bit more descriptive, she paused. She paused for a minute and she was like, it will take a lot for me to be descriptive. It's a lot easier for me to say, I saw my son the last time on July 11th. But to talk about that, the way how she looked at him, the way how he turned around, it really brought not only the emotions from the mothers, but I think from the listeners. It brought me to tears, even though I was in the room while we were recording interviews. But listening to the podcast in the past few days, I think that along with other survivors that you really get to experience, you become a witness. And the other feedback that really touched me was from a younger person, a younger woman, where she said, after listening to the 2 episodes, she listened to both, and she called me about 2 hours ago because she knows about this webinar. She was like, someone has to follow the path of the mothers. And if anything has given me more encouragement to do that, are these 2 episodes. And this is a survivor from Srebrenica. She has shared her story. And to hear that really sort of pushed me a little because I had not shared my story publicly. And now with this podcast, and I think, Kate, I'm really getting to a point where I do believe that I will have the courage to share my story as well.
That's absolutely amazing. Obviously, we would be honored to share your story when you feel comfortable doing so. I know that you mentioned in your answer about the ongoing genocide. And for a new audience who may have only heard the first 2 episodes of Untold Killing, and this may be new territory for them, the idea of genocide denial might not be an easy concept to understand, especially as Srebrenica is so well documented, and we've included some of the video footage and some of the audio from Srebrenica that shows what happened. Can you tell us a little bit more about genocide denial and the continuing effects in Bosnia?
Well, when it comes to genocide denial, we have a smaller entity in Bosnia and Herzegovina that has institutionalized the genocide denial. And what this means is that despite all of the facts, the forensic evidence, survivors' testimonies, both in court and outside of court, we have officials denying that any killing happened in Srebrenica. And if we look at the overall history of genocide denial is one of the last steps of genocide, which is why I said it's an ongoing genocide. To deny that something happened is actually killing the innocent victims all over again. especially when survivors, not only from Srebrenica, but the rest of Bosnia, are still searching for the remains of their loved ones. And in the podcast and the episodes that are coming, we will hear about that. But it hurts even more and it re-traumatizes the survivors. And this is happening on Bosnia almost on a daily basis, where whenever Srebrenica is mentioned, there is a comment that follows that says, but well, it did not happen. It was a crime, but it was not genocide.
Thank you. Aida has been waiting patiently. So while Aida unmutes herself, I'd just like to remind everyone that they can submit questions as comments on Facebook if you're watching live on Facebook. And you can also, if you are in our Zoom webinar, you can input them into the Q&A. So if you would like to ask a question of a panelist, we will get to questions at the end. So please submit them throughout and we'll choose some at the end. Now, Aida has been waiting patiently. And I think the thing that we have is the first 2 episodes of Untold Killing really focuses in on the story of Srebrenica and on the UN and what happened in Srebrenica regarding it being a safe area as well. You were a translator in the Bihać province for the UN. Can you first kind of describe for our audience where Bihać is in relation to Srebrenica? Because I think that's kind of important to establish before we continue.
Yes, of course. First of all, good evening and thank you for having me. Well, Bihać is actually northwest of Bosnia, so it's totally opposite from Srebrenica, and it was nicknamed Pocket, I would say, by international staff because actually it was like cut off by everybody. So it was surrounded by Serbs from Croatia as well as from Bosnia. So we were kind of there pretty much as like Srebrenica was cut off by everybody. And it was about 5 municipalities together with about 300,000 people there. 40,000 of them were actually refugees, people who came from different parts of Bosnia thinking that, well, searching for refuge basically, and they end up with us there. And I mean, the situation was the same pretty much like anywhere else. It was like shortages of everything, you know, no power, no food, no medication. But I think people realized that as long as we kind of hold on to that border around us, even though it kind of moved back and forward, we kind of felt that's the right thing to do, because we just knew once that kind of is broken, that's it. Like, you know, especially in the last week of July, because when we heard what happened in Srebrenica, we could only hear by radio, you know, honest to God, I thought this is it, like, because we were under siege and under massive attack as well. And I thought we were going to end up like Srebrenica, you know, that's how it felt.
What was it like in those, because obviously you got news of what had happened at Srebrenica. What was the general feeling in the town? What kind of conversations were occurring?
It was very scary because the lines have moved closer than ever, you know, and there was massive artillery all around us, and families haven't seen their male members who were on the front line defending the area for months. You know, they just couldn't come home. Usually they would come home maybe after a week or 2 weeks or even 3 weeks. But we knew if they don't come home, then something is terribly wrong. And then you hear this person died, that person died, got killed. You know, one of my best friends got killed on that line together with my brother. I mean, my brother didn't die. I mean, he was together with him, and I know how much impact that had on me. So we were all like sensing the worst and expecting the worst, to be honest.
You were given the opportunity to work with the UN. What was it like to work with the UNs, and what kind of things did you face as a UN translator at the time? What were the conditions like, and what kind of things did you do on a daily basis?
Well, the thing is that, you know, I was just a teenager when I started, and I knew that was my way of feeding my family and escaping starvation, basically. And the thing is, we were never trained for anything. We were never even told where we're going, what we were doing. So all I learned was literally that day, you know, and I just learned as with time to kind of adjust and then kind of be ready for some things. I mean, crazy things have happened. And maybe if I tell you a story about my first day, there, of course, I was so eager to, you know, to work, to earn my money, you know, and so I went to Bihać because I come from Sazin, and we went to Bihać. That was our HQ at the time, and our international team had military observers. They had a briefing in the morning. And one of them would come out after the briefing and he would say like a code name for like Alpha 5. And one of the girls, one of the interpreters would get up and say, oh, I'll do it, you know, and they kind of go to this patrol, you know. The next guy comes out and the same thing kind of happens, Bravo 6, and second girl gets up and go. And I'm thinking, that's it, like, I have to be very fast and like, I'm going to get a third one, you know. And the third guy comes out and he says this whatever code, and I'll do it, you know. It wasn't until later that I realized nobody else actually applied, you know, but I'm going to learn why. So obviously we had no protection. We didn't have any gear. The international staff, they had frag vests. Later, much later, we got them blue frag vests and the blue helmets, which were visible, and you were just kind of walking target anyway. So we drove somewhere briefly. I didn't really know Bihać at that time, so I just knew we came under the hill, bottom of the hill, and it was winter. It was December '93. It was like a lot of snow, like maybe half meter of snow, very cold. And so we met this soldier from a brigade, and he told us, "Oh yeah, we have to go, but we have to go up, you know." And I thought upstairs, you know, in the house or something, you know. But actually, no, we were like literally walking up the hill. And I remember the pathway being very, very narrow. Kind of nobody actually kind of walked before us. We were kind of making this trail in the snow. Now we walked up the hill. I didn't have much, you know, breath even, because I was translating constantly, and I was just like huffing and puffing. But I think I forgot all about that, because after some time, maybe 5-10 minutes of walking and this translating, suddenly everybody stopped, and the guy said, "Okay, run." I said, "What do you mean run?" And the guy said, "Well, you have to run because there's a clearing in." Because as we were walking up this hill, there was like a forest kind of following us, and suddenly there was this clearing of maybe 20 meters up the hill. And the thing is, because obviously there were shortages of everything, and I had boots that were leaking, you know, because I didn't have the money to buy new ones or even new ones to buy. And I had this beautiful coat that wasn't really functional at all because it's very, very long. And it was purple. So imagine me in a white snow, purple, trying to dodge snipers on my first day at work. So needless to say, I was just like, oh, what did I do? Why did I start working in all this? You know, so obviously I do that run. Luckily, nobody shoots at us. And then there was another one after like 100 meters or so, another 30 meters. I'm like, that's it, I'm beaten. And of course, eventually we get to the place we had to go to the top of the mountain, trenches. Of course, I was translating there, but then all this time I was just thinking about going back. I know it was down the hill, but you still think, you know, I was pretty easy target. And well, luckily it was a nice day, so all the haze came down, and because they were in the valley and they couldn't see us, so on the way back we could just kind of stroll, kind of relax. But that's the thing, you never really knew. Every day was different. And it pretty much depended on people you were with, because we were with international staff from different countries. So it was different cultures, different language, different level of professionalism. You know, some were not comfortable with working with women. You know, there was all sorts of different things we had to cope with.
There is actually a question that's come in from our audience. I think here would be a good place to ask this and put this both to you and to Almina. And that is, what is your opinion on the UN 25 years after Srebrenica? So obviously, Aida, you worked directly. Almina has dealt with the consequences of UN policy in Bosnia. So I was just wondering what your feelings or thoughts are on the UN. Yeah,
well, I still think the idea of UN is amazing. and as such, it shouldn't die. But there's so many flaws, and I'm studying history now, so I'm learning why it's so flawed, why there were so many flaws in it. Of course, there's so many different nationalities, as I just mentioned, different cultures. Everybody perceives things differently. But I still think that if you treat people with, as a humans, and with respect, then you can get so much more than looking at them from above and thinking you are the supreme race or supreme being. So as an idea, it's a good, but it needs a lot of work on.
Almina.
Well, I want to resonate what Aida said as well, but it did fail us in Bosnia. It failed us from the beginning of the war. When Bosnia was internationally recognized as a new state, and when it became a member of the UN in May '92, my hometown of Kozarac was completely demolished. But 25 years later, with all of its flaws, it still prevented a lot more killing in Bosnia than if the UN was not there. And I think with the lessons from Bosnia and the lessons that we can learn from other countries, that the UN has learned a lot, but there's still a long way to go, which is why I work very directly with survivors and why I'm trying to amplify their voices, because their stories do enable other individuals that are not even interested in the topic of genocide or the UN to understand why it is important to not only hear about these issues, but understand them. And the UN is a political international institution, so it does affect all of us internationally, worldwide.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you. I am going to move us onto a little bit more of a UK focus now. But I want to talk a little bit about what people are obviously, they are going to listen to Untold Killing, and they are going to want to do something with the information that they have now. So they have learned more about Srebrenica, they've learned more about Bosnia, and want to think about the kinds of things they can do in the United Kingdom. So first I'm going to go to Jake. Now, obviously, Jake has been making this podcast now for, it's been 6-7 months in total. It's been quite a long time. And I know that a lot of people that we work with want to do things like art projects, documentaries, podcasts. Jake, what advice would you give to someone who's thinking of creating podcasts like Untold Killing, or working perhaps on a project like this in Bosnia?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing on doing any kind of project like this, whether it's podcast or anything where you want to use creativity and art or whatever you want to call it to get a message across, is to gain a really deep understanding of the story and the subject matter, and to be able to really, really understand the implications of the story, the reasons why things happened, because that allows you to feel very confident about knowing, perhaps in moments where you're not sure what to do next or what the right thing to do to tell the story is you always have to get back to the story, the situation of what happened. And as long as you understand that, it makes everything else a lot easier. And I think it's also very important to trust yourself that if you're interested in this story, and if there are things that you want to know or things you wonder about or things you don't understand, other people are going to feel the same way. So for example, a lot of the time when making Untold Killing, a lot of the decisions, creative decisions, are things that if I heard something in an interview and that got my attention or made me feel, incredibly angry or upset or whatever the emotion is, I expect it will have a similar effect. And then it's obviously about understanding the craft of what you're trying to do and knowing the tools to best get it across. Because one of the things obviously that we spoke about when making the show, and you know, even when Almina mentioned at the beginning, you know how difficult it is to work on something like this. A big part is that you are taking someone else's story and trying to deliver it to someone you don't know and get them to feel a certain way, but you need to get the balance right of you know, making them feel the right sort of emotion, or getting them to think the right thing. But it always has to feel natural. It always has to feel true to the story. Again, back to the story, it has to feel true to the story and to the people that you're speaking to. And so, yeah, so you have to get the balance right of getting the tone right, and rely that the story itself will do a lot of the work for you. I think that's one of the main things, especially for this story, is it's so, the fates of the people and of the town and of Bosnia as a whole is so powerful in itself that actually it makes telling its story a little bit easier, because it's just getting people to hear it as well. Because once you get people's attention, they will feel incredulous, they will feel outraged.
Yeah, it's
right.
It does, yes. So yeah, I think that there are, it's one of the things that we commonly find is when people know about what happened, they want to do something, once people have found out about it, they want to move on to the next thing, they want to learn more, they want to tell other people about it. It's very much something that I think that I found across the board, is that people want to share the story of Srebrenica when they've had the opportunity to hear it. And Aida, I want to come to you as well, because you are on our West Midlands board, and you also work for YMCA North Staffordshire. You've been doing a lot of work this year and for many years in raising awareness of the Srebrenica genocide in Stoke and bringing communities together. And I was wondering if you can give us, I mean, and it might be difficult to narrow it down into 5 minutes, but a kind of whistle-stop tour of what it is that you've been doing in Stoke over kind of like the last few years, and the ways that communities and people can take the story from Untold Killing and then transfer it perhaps to the communities that they live in.
Yes, well, I've been very, very blessed to work for YMCA North Staffordshire, because they enabled so many amazing events here in Stoke-on-Trent, and past as well. Yeah, it started in 2015. I just started to ask my boss if we could have it, you know, at the YMCA. And before I even finished my sentence, my boss, Daniel Flynn, said yes, you know. So I thought that if I cook some Bosnian food, that would help people to kind of connect with the culture and who we are. And as usual, you know, that element of people kind of relaxing and just kind of being themselves and asking questions. So we have anything from 100 to 200 people on these events. We intentionally have these meals afterwards, so we can spend some time asking questions and for them to meet the guest speakers. Of course, this year it's been different because it's been online, but actually it's been also an amazing experience, because I in an attempt to kind of give some materials to people who couldn't come to our memorial. I've asked my friends to just write to me their experiences, you know, and I've learned so much about my friends so many years after than I ever knew. And I love them even more now. I'm so happy they're my friends, to be honest, you know, like I'm just like, oh my God, like I just didn't know this thing about you. So we definitely going to keep this online element in the future. When we came back from so when we had this first memorial, I think everybody was shocked and they all wanted to know more. And then they offered me to, together with Remember Srebrenica, to take young people across to meet some of the survivors, especially mothers of Srebrenica. And I just couldn't believe, you know, somebody that wants to do that, because I still think, as Jake has said, the story, that's the most important thing, and where to go, but then to the source of the story. So when you go, so we took, first time we took 3 young people from YMCA, and we took 4 students from Staffordshire University, and their lives have changed like dramatically. They all have gone back to their families with whom they were estranged for many years. And that's the thing. So sometimes the success of these trips can be like literally as simple as that, somebody going back to their own family, or people can go if they feel more confident to talk to other people, other communities and organizations within Stoke. So what we have done after the first visit, we realized how much impact it had. We then started to canvass other people from the community, and that's how we also took people from different walks of life. We now have cooperation with New Vic Theatre and Susan Moffat, the director, and hopefully we'll have a play ready, not unfortunately for this year, but hopefully for next year. Again, we have a waiting list for these trips. The young people want to do so much more. They have so many questions. You know, of course, most of them never heard of Bosnia until then, but they were so eager to hear and to learn. A lot of them went back to university, or they just wanted to make a difference, make a change, you know, for themselves as well as for the world. And that's exactly what we want to do with these trips.
Yes, thank you. I've actually had the pleasure of going and doing an event with you in Stoke, which was during Holocaust Memorial Day earlier this year. And it is, the people of Stoke are really open. Once they hear about what has happened, it really does like make them think. Obviously it was children, as an education person, that's mine. But you know, to see the cogs turning in people's heads and, oh, I want to do something, you can really see that, like, the impact of the kind of work that you've been doing up there and the work that's been happening in Stoke. And I have a friend who lives in North Staffordshire who always sees these flowers everywhere, in Stoke and across Stafford as well. So it's like, oh, the Chancellor was wearing it this week and things like that. So it's definitely having an impact in Stoke. Now, my final question before we go to the question and answer session is to ask about what each of our panelists thinks. We talk about lessons from Srebrenica and what lessons we can take away and what lessons we can learn. I think if we go to each person and say, well, what is the one thing that you hope that the listeners of Untold Killing and the people who obviously have come to this through Remembering Srebrenica, what's the one most important lesson from Srebrenica that you think people should take away and transfer to their communities? I'll start with Almina.
I thought Jake was going to go first.
Sorry.
No, it's a hard question, and I've been thinking about this for 2 decades now, since I started educating others about what happened in Bosnia in general, and not just Srebrenica. And as a survivor, I myself, the only thing I'm trying to do is really get others to understand what war and genocide does to an individual, to a community, and to all of us collectively as a humanity, and that it affects all of us. Even when we talk about Bosnia, it affects other communities, and if anything, I hope that the listeners will understand that hatred is the first step towards war and genocide, and that we have to be screaming against it, that we cannot and should not allow our community to go down that road of othering any community as the other, or viewing any other individual as less than a human being who should be killed just because their name is different. So I truly hope that they will understand that we need to build our communities to be better, and that a war does not bring anything but suffering and pain to everyone.
Yeah, I think that's as an overall sentiment. I mean, that's the main thing to take away from this. For me, obviously, only 2 episodes have come out so far, but obviously we will on the podcast in the future we'll talk more about the aftermath as well, and the impact this has had on you know, the people that you hear in the podcast, and on their families, and on other people who have learned about Srebrenica after the fact. They maybe volunteered and tried to help with spreading the word, or helping the survivors. And I think there's a few sentiments that we heard from people over and over again. One is that basically what happened in Srebrenica and in Bosnia can happen anywhere, and is happening right now in so many different places, and a lot of them have been in the news quite a lot recently. And when Almina says this isn't just about, you know, that this is about all of us, I think that's part of what that means, is that these things are happening to millions of people around the world all the time. And like I said at the very beginning, you know, it's about seeing what's happening around you and recognizing those signs, because every little bit of hate, again, like Almina said, can lead to this. You know, it can always lead to this, and it luckily most of the time doesn't, but the few times that it does go to this extreme stage that it got to in Srebrenica and so many other places, you know, those few times, it can't happen, it can never happen. And the other thing is that I think it's to never, because it's about all of us, but also it's about the survivors, and hearing the voices that we hear in the podcast of the mothers and Yasmin and everyone. It's that we can't make these people feel like they've been left behind. And I feel like remembering Srebrenica is amazing, that and all these other organizations that do this sort of work are amazing, that the survivors feel, it seems like they feel that there's always people that care about them and their story. But again, there's so many people in the world who've had similar things happen to them, and they have been left behind, or when it's happened generations ago and not 25 years ago, where we start to forget, and these people are left behind, and the stories are left behind. And that's what I love about doing the podcast, is that it's always going to be there. Every year on the 11th of July, new people are going to discover the story, and it's always going to be there for people to learn. So, you know, it's always important to tell everyone you can to hear the story.
Thank you, Jake. Aida, would you like to?
Obviously, I second all that both Almina and Jacob have said, and it's not much left for me to say. However, I will say one thing is that sometimes we think, you know, obviously we all have problems, especially this year has been very, very difficult for everybody, you know, but I always say that as long as you are alive and healthy and your family is alive and healthy, trust me, there's nothing you cannot do. So then I go back to all these families who have lost their loved ones, you know, dozens of them needlessly, you know. So, and again, if it happened in a country that speaks the same language, you know, same color of skin, it can happen anywhere, unfortunately, but it can. So, you know, I wish for people to just explore their communities, try different foods from different, you know, from a neighbor next door, or say hello to your neighbor. There's so many amazing things around us. Let's just enjoy life and then kill it.
Thank you, Aida. Okay, so we're now going to open to the Q&A from our audience. And the first question that we have in is for Almina. And this is from Mirella. And she says, I was really touched by your statement that you may finally be ready to tell your story of the war. I spent the whole war in Gorazda after escaping from Visegrad. For years, I have not been able to tell my own story because I felt that I needed to protect it, because it was the most and deepest part of me. Sharing it feels like I'd be losing a huge part of me. What do you think was the cause of your realization that you may be finally ready to share your story? And what do you think stopped you from sharing it all these years?
Mirella, thank you for your question. And I completely understand where your question is coming from. I have been there. The one difference that I did make is that I came back to Bosnia about 8 years ago because I needed to deal with my past. And I think that for our community in Bosnia and for a number of other communities, we are sort of expected to build our future, to think about our future, because our past, and especially, I assume your childhood, just like mine, was completely taken away from us and killed, and we became adults overnight. I've spent about 20 years amplifying the voices of other survivors because I felt that if I let others share their stories, that perhaps I will find a way to share mine. But I never felt that I had the correct platform or the words to say it. And this is where this podcast comes in. I've listened to a number of podcasts, but I have never been part of actually the team that produces one behind the scenes. And when you see that those, especially Jacob, has devoted so much time just understanding what happened in Bosnia, what happened in Srebrenica, and the way how they constructed the questions for the survivors, it finally made me realize that although my past and my story is the only thing that I have from Bosnia, from 92, I don't have a doll, I don't have anything, only the story. I finally realized that that part, that past is my present. And for me to think and talk about the future in a more positive way, I have to share it because I've been sharing other people's stories for such a long time that my story became just sort of a part as a background, as an experience that helps me help others tell their stories. But I think bringing the only thing that I have from my childhood will finally make others understand why I have been doing the work that I have been done. And also, I will never find the right word. You will never find the right word. No matter how much we read about what happened to us and other communities, we will never be able to explain and describe what happened to us, what was taken away from us, and the fear and everything else that we felt at the time. So just for me, I guess it will be 30 years in 2022 since I was expelled and since I survived the Napoli concentration camp, and I will be the same age as my mom was in 92. And all of this sort of boils up and brings out some of the reasons why we should do things that we are afraid to do. And I think I was afraid to tell my story, not because of how others will perceive it, but how I will listen to myself or read the story that I've written or told. So I think part of my fear of how I will perceive my own story has been sort of erased with this podcast, simply because I realize that it is the voice that I project and not necessarily the words that I use, because I think we have the words, we just need to let them out. I hope this helps. But I do have a smile now talking about it. Usually I would be very, calm and very selective of my words, but it's a good thing. It's a good thing to have a smile when you think about a very horrific and gruesome past that we have survived.
Thank you, Almina. We've got one more, well, it's kind of a little bit of a question, which I might put to Aida and Almina together. And that is from Robert McNeil, who actually features later in the podcast. And Robert was forensic investigator for, not forensic investigator, forensic, collected the evidence for the ICTY. And it says, Srebrenica is of course so important, but it was very good to hear what happened in Bihać from Aida and Kozarac from Almina. I'd like to know a little bit more about what happened in other parts of Bosnia. So I think if Almina, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about Sarajevo, just for those who are curious, and perhaps Aida can talk a little bit about what it was like specifically in Sazin. That would be a nice finish, I think, to the webinar. Almina, you're muted.
Am I unmuted? Okay.
Yes, you are.
I will just go briefly back to the beginning of the war, which I mentioned earlier. when we think about 92, 93, and 94, we don't usually talk about those years. When we talk about Srebrenica, we think of 95 and we think of the fall of Srebrenica. And I think the same with the siege of Sarajevo. When we talk about the siege of Sarajevo, we tend to think about when it ended and when the Dayton Peace Agreement was signed. But when the breakup of Yugoslavia happened in 92, Bosnia followed what Croatia and Slovenia did. It held a referendum, a legal, internationally legal referendum, where more than 66% of its population throughout Bosnia voted yes for the referendum for Bosnia to become independent. Bosnia was later recognized by the United Nations and the European Economic Community, which is today the EU, and it was later accepted to the UN. While this process was happening in April and May of 92, Sarajevo, on the 6th of April, was completely surrounded. And it is a very hilly, a beautiful city, but it is a valley, and it was very easy to surround it. And what is important to understand is that the Yugoslav National Army, which was under the control of Belgrade and Serbia, was the fourth largest army in Europe, and it was aiding the Bosnian Serbs. So they had all of the weapons, they had what was needed for the war to be successful, as they thought at the time. So for almost 4 years, the citizens of Sarajevo were completely cut off from the world without anything. As Saida said, they did not have anything. And they were shot on a daily basis, and snipers were killing them on a daily basis. And you have around 1,600 children just being killed in Sarajevo, mainly by snipers. And if we compare it to Srebrenica, and most of the survivors would say it was an open air concentration camp. People did not have anything, and they could barely survive. The only difference between Sarajevo and Srebrenica is that Sarajevo survived. In a sense, it was not taken over, and people were not killed in the way that the Srebrenica victims were. And this also goes back to Prijedor. And I have to mention Prijedor because Prijedor was attacked in April. And by May, at the end of the May, non-Serbs were either killed or in concentration camps. And after August, after the Red Cross and international journalists found out about the concentration camp, those that were lucky to survive ended up being refugees. And anything after that, there was no war in Prijedor. So when I came back to Bosnia, and when people would ask me, well, when did you leave Bosnia? Were you here during the war? I would say, yes, I was here during the war, but we left in 92. Because people did not know what was happening throughout Bosnia. They thought that we did not survive the war because we were not in Bosnia until 95. But it's very important to understand, as Jake said, the war was ongoing throughout Bosnia. And because Mirela mentioned Visegrad, what happened in Visegrad is almost unimaginable. People were herded into homes and being put on fire alive. So it is very important to understand that Srebrenica is the culmination of what happened in 92, 93, 94, and 95.
Right. So I think I started to tell a little bit about Sazin. For us, we were not shelled and shot at every single day because the area of Bihać pocket was fairly large, and the houses were scattered in some areas that were just like forests or fields. So they were not really viable for Serbs to use their artillery rounds on us, in a sense. So what they would do, obviously Bihać was different because Bihać the lines were very close to Bihać, and Bihać was more attacked than my hometown, which is about 30 minutes away. But the other areas were sparsely shelled and shot. The significance of that is that we have a mosque on top of the hill, which is in the town center. And they, every time for retaliation purposes, they were trying kind of to aim at that mosque They never got the mosque because it was very difficult to kind of, I guess, navigate. But every time they would miss the mosque, they would hit the houses behind the mosque in the valley. So with us, they would kind of let us relax for a few days, sometimes even a few weeks, to be honest. Especially when you're young, I was a teenager then, you know, so for us, oh yeah, it's all over, it's gonna be fine, you know. So you tell your parents, I'm just gonna go and meet my friends for coffee or something. And of course, parents being older and wiser, they knew the danger, so they were just absolutely terrified of us doing such a thing. So for in our area, they would wait for, let's say, market day, and they only fire 1 or 2 rounds. And that 1 or 2 rounds can do more damage than if they were to fire every day, like all day long in a field, basically. But I do remember them using surface-to-air missiles on us. That's the day when the whole of town of Sazin, and probably wider area, lost all of their glass, no windows. It was summer then, but obviously we spent the whole winter with just a plastic wrap on our windows. Not because we didn't have money to buy glass, but also because there was no glass to buy. We were under siege, so nothing could get in or get out. So there was cluster bombs were used as well. You know, for those who know a bit more about it, it's basically hundreds of small bombs within one big bomb. Then they scatter. And then they have like a small white ribbon, and the kids usually would say, "Oh, what's this?" It looks like a bell, and people were picking them up because people didn't know what they were, and of course they would explode, and they kill people like that. I remember actually I was on patrol when one of them fell on Sazin, and I remember one of the Swedish officers who went to the scene before my team. Was almost running down the street, and he said to my team, "Oh, it's a cluster bomb. Go back. It's very dangerous. Go back." And I never heard of it. You know, I didn't even know how to translate it, to be honest. And after maybe 5 minutes or so, we heard explosion. Somebody picked it up, and then actually I knew of the guy who got killed. There were air raids as well. So there was avia bombs dropped on us. There was a aircraft who tried to, because in Sazin we had the fixed production of ammunition, because that's the thing, we were left with nothing, so we had to defend ourselves somehow. So we had a metal factory there, which will then turn into production of ammunition. And Serbs obviously learned about it soon enough, and they sent the aircraft to bomb it. And the aircraft was flying very, very low, trying to kind of not miss it. But then there's 2 stories. One is that obviously one of the Bosnian army has take the aircraft down, or the fact that actually the aircraft hit the chimney, which was in the building next door, which we're not aware of, and actually that chimney was like tilted, kind of cut in half, and kind of tilted for many years after. And actually the plane crashed into the apartment building right next to it, where a kid died, and there was a lot of people injured, you know. So I think we had pretty much everything and anything happening there, unfortunately.
Thank you for sharing. Thank you for telling us a little bit more about the different areas of Bosnia and from your own personal experiences as well as what happened. We are now out of time for our panel tonight. So I want to say thank you to all of our panelists and to the audience who've participated both through Zoom and on Facebook Live. We are going to be hosting 2 further webinar panels throughout the run of Untold Killing, where you'll get a chance to hear more about those involved in the project and the survivors who were interviewed. Our next panel is on the 11th of November, and it will feature Aleksandra Bilić, who's the host of the podcast, Nadan Hadjic, who is the consultant producer, Hasan Hasanovic, who is the creator of Srebrenica Memorial Center and a survivor of the Srebrenica genocide, and Anessa Buljusmic-Kostura, who is our Deputy Director for Communications and Commemorations, and is also a survivor of the siege of Sarajevo herself. We look forward to seeing you at our next event. If you have time, please do fill out either the Google form that has been linked on Facebook, or if you have signed up through Eventbrite, it will be emailed to you, or participate in the on-screen polls now. Stay safe, and I hope to see you all at our next event.